Welcome everyone to our next excursion across the Jewish world. I'd like to invite today's guest speaker, Evgenia. I'm sorry I just butchered that. I know I did. I'd like to welcome her today to talk to us about the Jews of Ukraine. I am very excited about this talk just based on the last year, but also my ancestry. So that said, I'd like to turn it over to our speaker for the day.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ari. So my name is Evgenia. I'm really glad to be here today. Good morning, California. Good evening to me. I'm live from Haifa. Thank you for your invitation. Thank you that you found a minute to come and share with me the story of the Jews of Kiev and Odessa. And of course, Kiev and Odessa, it's not the whole story of Ukrainian Jewry, but these two large cities will show us some aspects of Ukrainian Jewish history. So here we go. This is the map of Ukraine. It borders Russia on the north and east. It borders Poland on the west, Romania and Moldova on the southwest, and here it goes down to Black Sea. And we'll begin with Kiev, which is the capital of Ukraine, and it's located further up to the north of the country on this big river. It's Dnieper, the biggest river in Ukraine. It kind of cuts the country into two parts. And Kiev, it's definitely the largest city in Ukraine. All of my data, all of my numbers are of course pre-war, because as long as the war is going on, I can't tell you how many people are still living in Kiev, how many people have left Kiev, how many Jews have left Kiev, or how many of them decided to stay. We will see the corrected data as soon as this war is over, and I believe we all hope that will come to its end as soon as possible. So Kiev, prior to this war, was home to over 3 million people and home to still a decent number of Jews. About 20,000 Jews have been still living in Kiev prior to February 2022. Kiev, it's this large city located on the river, combining old and new. There are some beautiful monuments and historical churches and castles of the old times, and also a lot of the Soviet architecture and even modern architecture. It's always possible to take a boat and float down Dnieper River. Dnieper is wide and it gives the city a beauty and a lot of fresh air. Kiev has some very important monuments in Ukrainian and also in Russian history. We will, at some point of our talk today, will come back to this square. This is the central square of Kiev, one of the most important churches here, and the monument to Bogdan Khmelnytsky. And we're going to speak quickly why the monument to Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who is in our Jewish history as it is observed as absolute evil, why is his monument located here on the main square of Kiev, and what he means to Ukrainian people. And Kiev was badly damaged during the Second World War. For a long period of time, it was occupied by Nazi Germany and then badly destroyed during the battles. So after the war, it was very much rebuilt in so-called Stalin Empire style. Look at these massive buildings, very typical of the Soviet architecture of late 40s and early 50s. If you've ever been to Moscow, then the main prospects, the main streets of Kiev may remind you of some of the parts of Moscow. But Kiev was lucky to preserve its historical beauty, to preserve some of its neighborhoods that still show us the beauty of the 19th century. This photograph was taken in the neighborhood called Podol. It's located near the river, and it's the neighborhood which used to be richly populated with Jews. So walking its curved streets, one can still find lots of the houses that originally belonged to the Jewish families. Kiev in both Russian and Ukrainian history is observed as a stronghold of Christianity. From the Russian perspective, Kiev is as important as, let's say, Moscow from the religious perspective. And the fact that Kiev is observed by the Russian government as the stronghold of Orthodox religion, it will also play its role in our history. The territory where Kiev is located, Kiev is marked on this map here on the river. So long ago, from the 7th to the late 10th century, Kiev was part of the state Khazaria. It was a kingdom of Turkic people. Most of them were nomads. What we know for sure is that the historical Silk Road, the historical trading routes that connected West and East, Christian and Muslim worlds, they went through the territory of Khazaria. And since we know that much of that trading was controlled by Jewish merchants, Rachtanites, we understand that they were constantly passing through Khazaria. There is a big discussion whether some members of Khazaria elite ever converted to Judaism, where they did not. It's still open historical discussion. But what we know for sure, what we can be sure, that in Kiev, even before Slavic people came to this territory, they were Jews at least passing through this territory. In the late 9th century, Kiev was taken over by Slavonic people, they were different tribes of Slavonic people. And so from 882, it became a capital of the state, which was named as Kievan Rus. Rus, because it was the name of the kind of a collective name of different Slavonic tribes here, and Kievan because it had capital in Kiev. We understand that Jews continued their living in Kiev in that period, so the government changed, but for Jews, there were no changes by then. What we know, for example, see, this is more of like a reconstruction of how Kiev looked like in the Middle Ages, in like 10th, 12th centuries. It's up to today. Kiev was always divided into like 3 sections, more or less. They exist up to today. And we know that, for example, here, there was a gate officially named as Jewish Gate. So we understand that they were still Jews living in some parts of Kiev. Also, there is a very interesting document. It's called Kievan Letter. It dates back to the first half of the 10th century, and it was discovered in Cairo, Geniza. It's the letter written in Hebrew by the Jewish community of Kiev to some other Jewish community. And it's the request for money. It's the letter which explains that one of the community members got in troubles. So now the community needs to collect the money, so to release him from the prison. And then we understand that this letter clearly means to us that there was Jewish community that continued its living in Kiev. There are some other written evidences, some of the letters and responses dating back to the same period. In general, it's hard to believe today, but in 11th, 12th centuries, Kiev was one of the, if not the largest city in Europe. It was a giant city for its time, with the population of over 100,000 people, with 8 market squares, with 400 churches. Was wealthy, flourishing city from every aspect of its life, and Jews continued their presence there. We also have the history of the first Jewish pogrom in Kiev. It's very well explained in Russian chronicles, speaking about Prince Vladimir Monomach, who had to come to Kiev specifically to calm down the situation because there was a Jewish pogrom in the city. There were some riots against Jewish moneylenders, pretending that the Jews set too high interest rates. So it's very well explained in the chronicles how Prince Vladimir Monomach had to decided to exile Jewish moneylenders from Kiev to calm down the situation. All this story could have gone further and further, but the history of Kiev changed in the 13th century together with the history of most of Russian lands those days. See, in 13th century, most of what was considered by Russian lands then was conquered by Tatar Mongols. Kiev was burned down in 1240. The city was nearly leveled to the ground, terribly destroyed. Most of the people were either murdered or stolen to slavery, no matter whether they were Christians, whether they were Jews. Tatar Mongols did not care for religion. They did not care for cities. They only wanted to grab treasures and people in order to sell them into the slavery. And the city has fallen into desolation, and for a very long period, we did not see it on the international stage. It stopped playing its important role for a very, very long period of time. In the 14th century, Kiev and surrounding lands, Kiev is here on this bright yellow background. These lands were conquered by the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Starting from the mid-16th century, Lithuania and Poland made a union. So we have this giant territory, all of Eastern Europe, all shades of yellow, bright yellow, and more of them, a beige color. Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, this giant kingdom of two nationalities of Poland and Lithuania. And we know that this giant land, step by step, was occupied by Jews. Jews were, in many cases, Jews were specifically invited by the Polish and Lithuanian landlords to settle in towns, in the private towns that belonged to the Polish landlords. See, if you look at this map, you will see that Poland, it's 16th century Poland, already had quite a number of towns. There's Lvov here, Lublin, Warsaw, while Lithuania was nearly empty, and it bordered with some wild lands. So the landlords needed somebody to come and actually live in their towns, and that's how they invited Jews. I usually explain it in more details when we speak about smaller shtetls, to speak about shtetls of Eastern Europe. So early 17th century, Kiev, small town with no more than 10,000 people. And yes, there are some Jews similar to the other towns in Poland and Lithuania. If we look at the general social structure of this Polish state, we will see that there were several groups, social groups. On top of the state, there was a king, of course, there was Catholic Church, and the most important Polish magnates, landlords, the owners of land, nobility, wealthy and powerful. They owned giant pieces of land, they owned farmland and also private towns. Then there were Jews. They played a role in all of Poland as middlemen, as managers of the landlord's property, as tax collectors, as city inhabitants. So they represented landlords on the market. They would control the mill, the shop, the wine production, and so on and so forth. They were people living in towns. Then there were Cossacks. It's independent military group. Basically, Cossacks were former serfs, peasants who ran away from their landlords, and also criminals who ran away from the troubles with the court and formed their own military, let's say criminal group. They were people in Cossack groups, they were people of different ethnicities. But they had to become loyal to their group, first of all. And then Cossacks, as this very strong military group, formed an independent army, so they could choose who they want to serve. So almost by the contract, they served Polish king, protecting especially the eastern borders of a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And underneath, they were Ukrainian peasants, especially in this part, in what's now is Ukraine. Here in the south, they were Ukrainian peasants. They were Orthodox. Polish magnates were Catholics, so Ukrainian peasants were Orthodox. They were all serfs, so they were basically slaves. They were stuck to their land. They were not able to leave and move to another location. They had lots of duties. They had to work for their landlord a certain amount of time. And basically, it's like on their shoulders that all this whole system had to lie. And then this whole structure sooner or later had to come to the very serious conflict. And there were several of them. And finally, it ended up in the big Cossack uprising. And we come to the mid-17th century when Bogdan Khmelnytsky started a Cossack war. This Cossack army decided to go against Polish landlords, against Catholic Church, to defend Ukrainian peasants, and in a willing to create their own Cossack state. If you look at the map of modern Ukraine here, so this Cossack state, they wanted it to occupy actually most of modern Ukraine. See, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, it was the uprising against the power of Polish magnates, against the pressure of Catholic Church, and against the Jews because they were associated with Poles, because they were seen as people who acted in favor of Polish magnates, seen as those who collect taxes, who set high prices in the market, who sell alcohol, and so on and so forth. And the reasons are similar. It was extreme poverty of Ukrainian peasants, the high taxes, and the pressure from the Catholic Church. The uprising lasted for about 5 years, and it ended up in 1654 when Ukraine, led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky, signed a treaty with Moscow, Russia, and became some part of modern Ukraine, including Kiev, became part of Russian state. Why they decided to sign a treaty with Russia? The same religion, Orthodox, absolute absence of Jews. There were no Jews in Moscow, Russia, and different privileges and lands that Russian Tsar granted to Cossacks. So we understand that in Ukrainian history, Bogdan Khmelnytsky is a national hero because he was the first to start a war against those who suppressed Ukrainians, against landlords, against Catholic Church, and against Jews. And so we have monuments to Bogdan Khmelnytsky, not only in Kiev. We have streets named after him, and we even have the city in Ukraine named Khmelnytsky. Now, what about Jews? Yes, the uprising was not only directed against the Jews. Yes, it was addressed Roman Catholic Church and the noblemen, but Jews were the easiest target. It was much easier, to murder Jews than to murder a nobleman who had their castles where they could stay safe. So this Bogdan Khmelnytsky uprising turned out to be one of the biggest tragedies in the history of Jews, especially history of Ashkenazi Jews. There is a book by Nathan ben Moses of Hanover. He originally wrote it in Hebrew, and it was published first in Venice in 1653. He is the witness of that uprising. So in his book, he explains what he actually saw. It's translated into English. You can easily find it. It's a very difficult reading because he explains every single way of murdering men, women, and children in the middle of the 17th century. The number of Jewish victims would be very different depending on what sources you look at. It might be as little as, as terrible as 30,000 Jews to as terrible as 300,000 Jews, depending where you find the information. Many more were sold in slave markets in Istanbul and Africa. This ended up the old history of Jews in Kiev, that long history of Jews living in Kiev since basically 7th century ended up in the 17th century. And there was a gap. And only in the late 18th century, in 1792, we see first Jews resettled in Kiev. Lots of things had happened between Bogdan Khmelnytsky uprising and the late 18th century. If you look at this map here on the left, it shows this light kind of a yellow territory. It's called the Pale of Settlement. See, in the late 18th century, giant Polish-Lithuanian state died. It lost in political and military battles. So it was divided among 3 empires. Most of it was occupied by Russia. Part of it was occupied by Germany, by Prussia, and part of it by Austria. The territory of former Polish-Lithuanian state, which was occupied by Russia, was already richly populated with Jews. So in the late 18th century, Russian government, Russian czars faced a problem. They received new territory, and on that territory, there was an incredible number of Jews, something new that Russia never had before. And it was Russian Tsarina Catherine the Great who in the late 18th century made this law, which is called a Pale of Settlement, the Pale of Settlement, meaning that Jews were able to continue their living in this traditional area in Minsk, in Vilna, in Zhytomyr, in Pinsk, in Warsaw, and so on and so forth. They were able to continue their living there, but they were not able to visit and settle the other parts of Russia. So it was like invisible fence, the Pale of Settlement. As you can see on the map, Kiev was actually located in the very heart of this territory, the Pale of Settlement. And so Jews from the surrounding shtetls started arriving in Kiev looking for new opportunities for, offering their services, their goods in a bigger city. So we already see in 1792-93, they were Jews who settled in this neighborhood called Podol. It's this one, same neighborhood, but just different periods of time. Podol because it's near the river. And in 1798, Jews purchased a piece of land to organize the cemetery. And 20 years passed, we have 1,500 Jews, 2 wooden synagogues. But then, remember, Kiev is considered by the Russian czars as the stronghold of Christianity. So Russian czars decided that Kiev was too holy for Jews. So that Kiev had to be cleaned out of Jews. And in 1827, Jews were exiled from Kiev and prohibited to settle there. So Jews were able to live everywhere around it, but not in Kiev. But in Russia, we have a saying that law is like a column. It's very hard and nearly impossible to jump over it, but you can always go around. And that's exactly how it has always been working in Russia and up to today. It's the same. Even the law, which is very, very strict, the strictest law, you always find a way to go around. So Jews willing to settle in Kiev were always finding their ways to go around, bribing the officials, staying in the hotels, and so on and so forth. The situation changed dramatically in 1860s, when there was new law that let Jews of the special categories settle everywhere in Russian Empire. They were merchants of the first and second guilds, meaning the wealthiest merchants, professional artisans and craftsmen, retired soldiers with their families, and Jews with higher education. So some categories of Jews that were considered by the government as useful, they became free from the pale. And look at these numbers. As soon as this new law was launched, in 1862, there were 1,400 of Jews in Kiev. This is official data. We know that especially in Kiev, the actual numbers were much higher than the official ones. Next year, the number of Jews doubled. In 10 years, from 1,400 Jews, we get to nearly 14,000 Jews. And prior to the World War I, they were officially over 1,000 Jews. We see that Kiev of the late 19th century attracted Jews. Jews from the Pale of Settlement, from the smaller and bigger shtetls, wanted to come to Kiev looking for better life, legal or illegal. They knew there was work. There was when shtetls were becoming poorer, then Jews understood that there was a chance to make money, to change life of your family here in Kiev. By the late 19th century, Jews were nearly half of all Kiev merchants, and 25% of all Kiev goods were produced on Jewish manufacturers. One of the greatest things the Jews gave to Kiev, something that they brought to Kiev from another location, it was so-called contract market. This is Contract Market Square in Kiev, in Podol neighborhood, the Jewish neighborhood. It's old photograph, a new one. It's the same building. This is exactly the stock exchange building here. Contract market means it's not a market to sell like bread or milk or basic things. No, it's the market where you sign big contracts, mortgages, sale and lease of estates and businesses, big bread and sugar trading that say the bread of the next year. So it's big business. Jews were about 60% of that contract fair participants. From the memoirs of people living in Kiev in the late 19th century, they say Kiev got overcrowded. Every single hotel was full. Everyone knew he could make money over the time that contract market took place in Kiev. Contract market brought much money to Kiev and let Kiev be rebuilt according to the fashion of the 19th century. This money made Kiev much nicer, much more modern city of that time. When we walk around Kiev, wherever we go, we will recall the name, the unique family of Brodsky, the sugar kings of Imperial Russia. Lazar Brodsky and his younger brother Lev Brodsky, they controlled about 25% of sugar market in Russian Empire, plus they had lots of other businesses. Their last name Brodsky means that the family originated from the town which is in Ukraine, now in Western Ukraine, called Brody. They had the biggest mill in Kiev. They had brewery. They produced paper. They controlled transportation in Kiev and the region. For example, the city tram, the railroad. They had Dnieper shipping company. They provided Kiev with water supply and sewage system, and they built lots of public institutions in Kiev. For example, this beautiful almost castle is Kiev Polytechnic University. That was, the construction was all sponsored by Brodsky family. It was open for everyone, for Christian and Jewish kids. The opera, the former opera house, the hospital, and the market. It's this beautiful market. When tourists come to Kiev, they're still brought to this historical market, the central market of Kiev. All of it was built thanks to Brodsky family, and market was presented to the city. Brodsky only wanted that 25% of the taxes would go to the charitable activities. Altogether, there are over 20 different public institutions that were given to Kiev by Brodsky family. And of course, they had to build a synagogue. So this is Grand Choral or Brodsky Synagogue in Kiev, built in the late 19th century. It's modernized synagogue. It's the synagogue built in this modern style, looking at the best examples of European synagogues. Of course, they were looking at Austria, first of all. In Soviet time, it was confiscated, but now it again belongs to Jews. It's again used as a synagogue. And it was built in this long facade, see, with this kind of a Gothic style. Arches, interior, reminds us of the best European synagogues of the 19th century, this large hall with the open air balcony for the ladies. This was the synagogue of Maskilim, of modernized Jews, of Jews who followed the tradition of European enlightenment, of the Jewish enlightenment in Europe, so that they would come here dressed nicely, and the service would be accompanied with the choir, and then the ladies were able to see everything very well sitting here on the balcony. Brodsky Synagogue was confiscated in the Soviet times in 1926 and used as a theater. That's how it was not destroyed during the Second World War, because it was not a synagogue by then. It was returned to the Jewish community after the fall of Soviet Union in 1992, and then in 2000 reopened after the restoration. You can see here the photograph of Chabad Lubavitcher rabbi. Today, the synagogue belongs to Chabad movement, and it would be true for most of the synagogues on the territory of modern Ukraine, and as well as most of the post-Soviet countries. When the Soviet Union fell apart, when the freedom of religion was proclaimed, Chabad was first Jewish movement to come into the country and to offer all kind of services to people, to establish connections with the government. So now most of the historical synagogues belong to Chabad movement. These are different private mansions that belonged to wealthy Jews of Kiev in the late 19th century. Kiev Jewish community was growing fast. There were lots of opportunities for making money. Of course, there was this tiny layer of elite. Most of the Jews were not wealthy, were not even well-to-do. They were very poor. But still, we have this memory of the wealthy families, like this blue house belonged to Polikov, who was the railroad king, and so on and so forth. This is a former Hasidic synagogue. See, the synagogue of Brodsky, it was the synagogue of Maskilim, and this was the synagogue of the local merchants, Hasidic synagogue in Podol neighborhood, also late 19th century. Interestingly enough, it was reopened after the Second World War, and in Soviet Kiev, in post-war Soviet Kiev, it was the only active synagogue. On the high holidays, it was visited by thousands and thousands of Jews. It was absolutely packed. Now it's active. It was beautifully restored, so there are daily services here as well. They're really nice. There's of course very modern stained glass windows here. I'll show you another historical synagogue that survived in Kiev, Galitskaya, meaning it was built by Jews who came to Kiev from Galicia, from Western Ukraine. It's early 20th century. In the Soviet times, it was used as a diner for workers. And then in 2001, returned to the Jewish community. Now it belongs to Midrashat Zionit, the international Jewish organization, which is connected to the state of Israel. 1881 marks the border in the Jewish history in Ukraine and in general in Russian Empire, because in the March of 1881, Russian Tsar Alexander II was assassinated in St. Petersburg, in the capital of Russian Empire. But Jews were blamed that it was them behind the organization. It was not true. It was the idea of the government, an idea of conservative press to blame Jews, to say that Russian people would have never even thought of assassinating their Tsar. So spring of 1881, we have the first giant wave of Jewish pogroms in the Pale of Settlement. And we see that government did not stand for Jews. The government blamed Jews in all sins and considered Jews to be guilty. And that we see pogroms in every single town around the Pale of Settlement. And of course, we see it in Kiev. And the late of April 1881, there was Jewish pogrom in Kiev with quite a number of Jews murdered and Jewish women raped, and many Jewish homes and shops were destroyed. And again, the reaction of the government and mass media was that pogroms are provoked by the economical activities of Jews. 1881, it's the beginning of mass immigration of Jews from the territory of the Pale of Settlement. Jews started leaving those places where they had been settled for centuries, understanding that the situation changed and that even being very loyal, proper citizens, they cannot expect governments to defend them. At the same time, it's the beginning of Aliyah to the land of Israel, and it's the beginning of Jewish participation in the socialist movements. 25 years later, there was another wave of Jewish pogroms in October 1905. Every step, the pogroms were becoming worse and worse, and this time they were over 7,000 houses destroyed and over 100 Jews murdered. And it's clear that in Kiev, local authorities actively contributed to the rioters. It was the governor of it was the police chief of Kiev who used to stand on the balcony of the public building, calling the rioters, beat the Jews, rob, break. Instead of stopping them, he kind of gave them the green light. And this way, this time, Russian government blamed Jews for being revolutionaries, saying that the Jews were revolutionaries and socialists, and so that's why good Russians and good Ukrainians wanted to get rid of them. 1911, it's a year of that infamous, terrible story of Bailey's trial, but the story with happy ending. It was classical blood libel when at the time of, prior to Passover, the dead body of a 12-year-old Christian boy was discovered in a cave in the outskirts of Kiev. So of course, the press, the monarchist, rightist press, launched the anti-Jewish campaign accusing Jews of using human blood for, of course, baking matzah. Pretty well-known story. This man, Mendel Menachem Beilis, he was just an ordinary Jewish man. He was arrested, sent to prison, and he remained there for over 2 years for the period of the trial. I have to say that the best lawyers arrived in Kiev to defend him, to stand for him, including Oscar Brusenberg, one of the best lawyers of Russian Empire. And you know what? They managed to win, even with that incredible pressure from the government, from the church, from the press. There was a jury of very simple, uneducated, illiterate Russian and Ukrainian peasants, and even them, who had no sympathy to Jews at all, but they were impressed. And after several hours of deliberation, they declared Beilis not guilty. He left then with his family to Israel. So it's an interesting case. It's one of the greatest victory of the Jewish lawyers against Russian government, against police, against press, against the church. I'll show you some more photographs of Kiev streets, some nicer ones and some poorer ones. Most of the shops that you see here, they belonged to Jews, the markets, the shops, the banks, the hotels, lots of businesses. This says it's the store and production of Joseph Marshak. He was the famous Jewish jeweler of Kiev. See, it's this whole building belonged to him, and more of it. See, this is the hotel. Hotels were usually Jewish businesses. Jewish businesses were always hotels, cinema, photography, printing houses, aside of the traditional barbershops and sewing and shoe producing and production of watches and so on and so forth. But cinema, printing, and photography, hotels, that they were specifically Jewish businesses. 1917, we had revolution in Russia, which was followed by civil war when the country was divided into reds and whites. Reds being Bolsheviks, communists, who wanted a communist state, and that's Lenin, and whites who were nationalists, anarchists, monarchists, constitutional democrats, lots of different political and military groups, and among them, lots of just criminal groups who took advantage of this time to just start pogroms and grab and kill. The time of the civil war in Ukraine is marked as the time of the terrible Jewish pogroms all over Ukraine. There is there are some researchers clearly saying that the Jewish pogroms of civil war were exactly the way to the Holocaust. It's just this clear path. By that time, there were over 100,000 Jews in Kiev, and I have to tell you that it was safer for Jews to be in Kiev than in the smaller shtetls. Because here Jews were able to organize some self-defense. They were able to defend themselves against the Cossack armies. Finally, in 1920s, the civil war ended up, and Kiev, together with the rest of Ukraine, Ukraine became Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. At the beginning, Kiev was not a capital; it was Kharkiv, the city in the east of Ukraine. But then they moved the capital to Kiev. Kiev kept attracting Jews. You can see that 1923, 128,000 Jews. 1926, 140,000 Jews. Why? Because the old economical connections were destroyed. The life in the former shtetls was impossible, absolutely. Jews lost the base of their living. Private business was not allowed by Soviet government. The only option was to come to the big city and get a job in a factory, or send your children to the state school, so get work in construction, so become proper Soviet citizen. And lots of Jews from the surrounding shells kept coming to Kiev looking for a better life, looking for the opportunity to become proper, normal Soviet citizens. In 1920s, all Jewish religious and of course Zionist institutions were closed. Zionism was considered a crime and religion was banned in Soviet Union. I'm sure you know that Soviet government wanted communism to be the only religion and never accepted any competition. In 1930s, there was a period when Kiev became the center of the great development of the new Soviet Yiddish culture, with schools, theaters, literature, mass media in Yiddish. But it did not last for long. It lasted in 1930s, and then prior to the war, those activities were also closed by the Soviet government. This picture on the right, it shows you 4 religions: Orthodox, some Protestant, Muslim, and Judaism. And it's the illustration to the idea that Soviet government didn't care for what type of religion was it. It just did not like any religion. So any religion was banned, and running any religious activity was considered a crime against a Soviet regime. By 1939, there were about 224,000 Jews in Kiev, nearly 30% of the city. 22nd of June 1941, Nazi Germany attacked USSR, and July-August. In three months, Nazi were already in Kiev. By that time, about half of Kiev Jews left Kiev. Men joined the army. Men joined the Red Army, so they were on the front. Many Jews were evacuated from Kiev together with the places where they worked, like research institutions, governmental institutions, factories. They were evacuated by the Soviet government. So Soviet government did not want to save Jews specifically, but they were evacuated together with their institutions. At the same time, there were many Jews who ran from the west to the east, so from the western Ukrainian lands towards Kiev. So finally, by the time of Nazi occupation, there were about 150,000 Jews in Kiev. But immediately, the banners were put on the walls of the buildings saying that 29th of September at 8 in the morning, the Jews had to come down to a specific place with documents, money, and private belongings. The same document said that whoever doesn't come will be shot. Whoever tries to rob Jewish apartments will be shot as well. It actually gave Jews kind of a hope that nothing bad was going to happen. You know very well from the history that all Jews of Kiev were murdered on the territory which is called Babi Yar. Here, it's the forest to the northwest of Kiev. Altogether, there were about 200,000 people murdered in Babi Yar over 1941-43, absolute majority of them being Jews. In Soviet times, Jews of Kiev were absolutely prohibited to speak about this tragedy. The monument, which was put up here in 1976, so 30 years after the war, did not mention Jews at all. And it's only after the fall of Soviet Union in September 1991 that the new memorial with menorah and the inscription in Ukrainian and Hebrew was put up here in Babi Yar. It's a big subject of how Soviet government tried to kill the memory of Holocaust among Soviet Jews, and Kiev is a very specific example of that. Why was that? Maybe because of this. September 1945, after the end of the war, Jews returned to Kiev. Many returned from the front, and we have the last Jewish pogrom in Kiev in 1945. And this time, first time in the history, government, it was Soviet government, KGB, who actually choose to stand for Jews and stopped the pogrom. The reason for that, see what happened, there was always a problem with apartments in Kiev. Kiev was terribly destroyed during the war, so non-Jews who survived the war in Kiev, they occupied former Jewish apartments, not expecting Jews to come back. But now Jews are back. So there was this Jewish man who came from the front, who had a gun, who was an officer in the army, who wanted to return to his original apartment, but was met by Ukrainians who did not want him to enter. So there was a conflict. And so as a result of that, he shot 2 Ukrainian men, and the pogrom started all over Kiev. 5 Jews were murdered, nearly 40 seriously wounded and had to stay in hospital. But Soviet government stopped it the same day and clearly stated the Jews were to receive their pre-war houses or apartments. So this time, in a certain way, KGB acted in favor of Jews, but the payment, the price that the Jews paid was very high, but Jews were not allowed to even mention a word of Holocaust. Jews were not allowed to mention anything that had happened to their relatives in Kiev during the Second World War, or in Ukraine, or in Soviet Union in general. The period of the post-war, it's period of Soviet Union, the story of refuseniks, the story of the general story of the Jews in Soviet Union. Kiev stayed a very Jewish city. It preserved its Jewish population in a certain way. Of course, they were mainly highly assimilated Jews. The older generation kept speaking Yiddish, very often hiding it away from the younger generation, keeping it as their secret. But the major changes took place after the fall of Soviet Union, when in the independent Ukraine, Jews became free as everybody else. So now, prior to the war, those of you who had a chance to visit Kiev, you were able to see Hanukkah on the main streets of Kiev. There's wonderful Shalom Aleichem Museum, who speaks about the life story of this greatest Yiddish writer, and also shows us, the museum shows us the everyday life of Jews in old Kiev. There are active synagogues, and also this is something interesting. This is modern. It's Chabad village built near Kiev to accommodate Jewish refugees who are running towards Kiev from the eastern part of Ukraine since 2014. So interestingly enough, out of nothing, we have this new Jewish settlement near Kiev. From Kiev, I want to take you down to the south to Odessa, to the shore of Black Sea. Odessa is much more modern city. It was only established in 1794, so it's very new compared to Kiev. It's home to about 1 million people and still large Jewish population of about 30,000 Jews. Odessa is beautiful. Odessa is warm. Odessa smells like the city near the sea, the salty smell of the seawater. Odessa has beautiful green boulevards and fountains. Odessa is about gorgeous European style architecture, but squares and marine with yachts and beaches. And this gorgeous staircase that's supposed to remind us of Rome. And something that when you come to this passage, you think, are you in Milano, or it's much similar to some of the best European architectural Examples. Odessa is beautiful, warm, and tasty. Odessa is known for the great, specifically Jewish food, for the great music, for its unique vibe, its unique atmosphere that you can never forget once you've been there, once you tried it. Odessa, originally, it was a small fortress that belonged to the Ottoman Empire, and Russia occupied this land in the late 18th century as a result of the Russian-Turkish War, and decided to establish here a port on the Black Sea. So the new city was established in 1749 as military and commercial port, and then gave it, the Russian Tsarina Catherine the Great gave it a Greek name, Odessa. From the very beginning, Odessa was multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-religious city. They were Jews who had been living here since Ottoman period. They were Greeks, Bulgarians. It was all mixed. And Odessa was really lucky. In the early 19th century, it had an incredible governor. He was French. He was Duke de Richelieu. He was French, and he arrived here, and he built Odessa as the best European city, with the wide streets, with public parks, with churches of different Christian denominations, with synagogues, with hospitals, theaters, markets, schools. So by 1815, 20 years after it was born as a city, Odessa became a prominent, well-built, and comfortable European city. And in 1819, it received a status of Porto Franco, the right of duty-free import and export of goods, free port, and immediately, especially Jews, there were others, there were Greeks also, but Jews started arriving in Odessa to try their fortune. Porto Franco, it means that you can try work here as dealer, buying and selling foreign goods, making money fast. Odessa became one of the main transshipment points of the Mediterranean and Black Sea trade, especially for bread and sugar trading. In the early 19th century, we already see 7,000 Jews in Odessa. They were arriving basically every day. Every day, the Jewish community of Odessa was growing. There were synagogues, shohet, cemetery, mikvah, of course, hospital. The Jews made, of course, unions, they have Rakadisha, and so on. The Jewish community of Odessa from the very beginning was the least, one of the least religious in Russian Empire. Jews who came to Odessa were looking to change their fortune, to change their life, and they were not interested in religious life that much. They were among the most, they became among the most assimilated Jews in all Russian Empire. By the late 19th century, there were already over 150,000 Jews in Odessa. Officially, they were about 30 to 40% of the city's population. But in the feeling, like if you ask any Russian-speaking person, especially Jew, he would say, oh, all of Odessa was Jewish. It was just, in our feeling, in our understanding, in our impression, it was like all of the city was Jewish. The famous synagogue, Brodskaya synagogue, of Odessa, built by the Jews that arrived here from Brody, very modern, very much away from the traditional synagogues of the Pale of Settlement. Famous for its beautiful choir, famous for the for its cantors and the rabbis who spoke Russian much better than Yiddish, because this was required by their congregation. This is another main city synagogue built in the mid-19th century. It was confiscated in 1919 and then returned to Jews in 1996. So it's active synagogue. Brodskaya synagogue, unfortunately, is still not returned to Jews. It belongs to the State Archive of Ukraine up to today. Look at this cemetery. I mean, Jews of Odessa, they knew how to live. They knew how to build, how to live, and how to show off. Odessa is considered a birthplace of many things, good and bad. Some say that Odessa is the birthplace of Jewish pogroms in Russian Empire. Much before the first wave of pogroms in other parts of Russia, they were Jewish pogroms here starting from 1821, mainly organized by Greeks against Jews because of the economical competition. I have to tell you, Jews still won and finally controlled most of Odessa market, and Greeks could not compete with them. Odessa is the birthplace of Jewish self-defense. In 1881, the Jewish self-defense squad was formed in Odessa as an answer, as a reaction to the Jewish pogrom. It was very dangerous because government observed Jewish self-defense as criminals because they never wanted to act against Christians in favor of Jews. Jewish self-defense squads, they were strong men, they were butchers, of course, strong ones, they were cabmen and blacksmiths, but they were students, they were professionals. This man, look at this man, Waldemar Wolf Hefkin, an incredibly talented man, the doctor who developed and first used vaccines against cholera and bubonic plague. He was the leader of the Jewish self-defense forces of Odessa. So Odessa is the birthplace of this new self-identity. We're not just victims, we want to defend ourselves. This is the special architecture of Jewish Odessa. Most of Odessa Jews lived in the tiny apartments, in the houses with balconies overlooking the tiny courtyards. So the life was visible. Everybody could hear you. Everybody could know what kind of relations you have with your husband, what you eat for lunch, what kind of pants you're wearing. And when your son goes down here to play with other boys, you simply come out to this balcony and cry out, Monya. And he would put up his head and said, Mom, what? Am I cold or hungry? Because that's the reason mothers call for their sons, to feed them or put extra clothes on them. Many of these original houses still exist, still preserving that unique atmosphere of Jewish Odessa. A famous Jewish Ukrainian writer, Isaac Babel, spoke about Odessa. He said, think, it's a city in which it's easy to live, in which it's clear to live. Half of its population is Jews, and the Jews are people who have learned a few very simple things very well. First, they get married in order not to be lonely. Second, they love in order to live forever. Third, they save money in order to have houses and give their wives fur jackets. Fourth, they love children because it's very good and necessary to love your children. This is the best explanation of the circle of Jewish life in Odessa. Odessa is considered to be the birthplace of the unique Jewish humor. Humor is hard to be translated. There are lots of Odessa Jewish anecdotes in Russian and in Yiddish. Look, some of them that I put here, like, Monya, how much is it? 7 multiply 8. Are we buying or selling? Or wife asks her husband, Silma, why don't you wear a wedding ring? And he answers, in this heat. Or 2 friends come to visit, and one of them knocked on the door with his foot. Why are you knocking with the foot? Asked the second. So that the owners thinks our hands are busy with gifts, otherwise they won't open. Odessa Jewish humor shows us this unique attitude to life. It's like what we say in Israel, "Akol yeh beseder," like everything will be all right at the end. Yes, it's hard life. Yes, it's not easy, but we will survive. With our attitude to life, we manage to overcome. In the song that was playing at the beginning, you maybe heard the words Odessa Mama. What's that? What does that mean? What's that? For whom Odessa is considered as a mother? 4 Jewish criminals. Odessa is the mother of the Russian Jewish criminal world. And some of the Jewish criminals of Odessa were just incredibly creative. Look at this story. This is the goldsmith and the metal worker, Israel Rochomovsky. Once he was commissioned to create a tiara, which was supposed to look like ancient Greek tiara. He produced it, and later on, it was sold to Louvre as the fake Greek tiara claimed to be made in the 3rd century BC, and Louvre purchased it and paid an incredible amount of money for it. And when it was put on the display, some of the researchers said, it looks too new. It's in a too perfect shape. So they started research and they figured out it was new. And now I heard that this tiara was being given to Israel as the work of incredibly talented Jewish jeweler. There was a whole class, the whole social group of Jewish criminals in Odessa. They had different specialities, like those who would sold polished brass watches like gold, those who would steal horses, those who would rob hotel rooms, and so on and so forth. This man, his name is Mishka Yaponchik, Michael Japanese. He lived in this very place. He was the king. That's also him with his squad, criminal group, and he was the king of the Jewish criminal world of Odessa. And when the new pogrom broke down in 1905, Mishka Yaponchik, Michael Japanese, became the head of the Jewish self-defense forces. It was a terrible pogrom that lasted for 5 days and nights, but there were several thousand Jews who joined self-defense forces, who wanted to defend their life, Even women participated in it. It was very difficult. Jews were not allowed to have guns, so they armed themselves with axes, billhooks, shafts to defend their families, to defend their homes. Still, about 500 Jews were murdered and several thousand Jews seriously wounded. But again, we never forget that it was Odessa that Odessa Jews that first wanted to stand and defend themselves. Odessa is the birthplace of the Zionism in Russian Empire. It's this man, Leon Pinsker, who published his famous book, Auto-Emancipation, in 1882, where he clearly said that the great ideas of the 18th and 19th centuries have not passed by our people, meaning Jews, without leaving a mark. Now we feel not only as Jews, we feel as men. And as men, we too wish to live like other men and be a nation like the others. Havebeen, that famous Jewish organization that started buying land in Palestine those days, it was established here in Odessa. Odessa, it was the place where it was like a big pot where people were boiling in it, where people of different origin could meet, interact, and where new ideas were born. Some of the famous residents of Odessa, it was future mayor of Tel Aviv, Mayor Dizengoff. For about 10 years, he lived in Odessa. At the same time, it was Zev Jabotinsky, one of the Zionist leaders one of the Jewish Zionist leaders. He also he was born in Odessa, and he lived in the young age in Odessa. Moshe Shertok, this little boy, later Moshe Sharet, the second prime minister of Israel. He is here in Odessa with his family. His father is reading Odesky Listok, the newspaper. Most of the newspapers in Odessa actually were printed in the printing houses that belonged to Jews. So that's, again, the printing and photography, Jewish business. Literature, modern Jewish Hebrew and Yiddish literature. Shalom Aleichem lived for a very short period of time in Odessa, but it's here that he wrote The Adventures of Menachem Mendel, explaining the phenomenon of this new Jew, the Jew of the air. Chaim Nachman Bialik, the father of modern Hebrew literature, at the 7 years old, he ran away to Odessa from another place to study Russian language and European literature, and it's here that he published his first lyrics and became a Hebrew poet and a writer. Look at this meeting. These are Jewish writers in Odessa in 1910, probably discussing what's the future of Jewish literature is going to be, whether it's Yiddish or it's Hebrew, what path are we going to take? So Odessa is definitely a birthplace of the modern Jewish literature. The music. In Odessa, we say if an Odessa child, meaning Jewish child, goes without a violin, then he plays the piano. The famous Jewish violin players are from Odessa. You can ask me why. What's the point about teaching your son playing a violin? And I can explain it easily. Imagine you're a Jew, late 19th century, early 20th century. You come to Odessa from the shtetl, you really want to become rich. But how many Jews become rich? Very, very small percentage. So imagine you stay as a shoemaker, you live in that tiny place and having a balcony, and you understand that your son will probably continue your style of living and will become a shoemaker, but you don't want this future for your son. You want to give him something different, to give him different future. So a choice would be to teach your son playing violin, because if he does well, he will be accepted to the orchestra. And in the orchestra, they always need many violin players. And if he does well, he'll be able to go to St. Petersburg. If he does very well, he'll be able to play in Vienna. So it will give your child better future. So that's how thousands and thousands of Jewish kids were tortured with violence all along their childhood. Ruslan, the ship, the famous Israeli Mayflower of 1919, the ship which after the revolution, during the civil war in Russia, brought 671 Jews from Odessa to the land of Israel. And among them, why it's Mayflower? Because it brought future Israeli elites in politics, culture, and science, scholars, architects, doctors, poets, writers, composers, painters, and more and more. And among them, Baruch Haggadati, the Israeli classical ballet dancer, choreographer, and film producer. Rachel Bluestein, known as Rachel, the poetess, we have her portrait in our 20 shekel banknote, the beautiful, gorgeous, incredible Hebrew poetess who died at a very early age. Joseph Klausner, future Israeli historian and professor of Hebrew literature, the chief editor of Encyclopedia Hebraica. Ruslan actually took the best Jews from Odessa and brought them to Israel, bringing all that culture, all that Jewish culture from Odessa to the land of Israel. In October 1941, Odessa was occupied by Nazi German Romanian army, and Odessa became the capital of Transnistria. It's the state kind of controlled by Romanian government, and Romanian Jews were all deported to Transnistria to be murdered here. There were about 80,000 Jews in the city. Majority of original Odessa Jews managed to leave the city. Although the Soviet government till the last minute continued saying that we were not going to give up, Odessa will never be given to Nazis. So many Jews could have never believed that Nazis might be in Odessa. Lots of Jews were deported here from Western Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania. An absolute majority of them were finally murdered in death camps around Odessa. About 600 Odessa Jews survived in the concentration and death camps in this area. Some Jews survived in catacombs. If you're ever in Odessa, take a tour of catacombs. This is the chain of catacombs. Many of them are former limestone mines. It's underground labyrinth, the largest in the world. It's about 1,500 miles. It's like a network of basements, bunkers, tunnels, and so on and so forth. The group of partisans and the group of Jews managed to survive there during the war. And this is the photograph of a Jewish family down in the basement and the Jewish partisans coming out of catacombs when Odessa was liberated in 1944. There is a book which unfortunately has never been translated into English. It's called 820 Days in a Dungeon, written by Lucia Kalika. She was 18 at the beginning of the war, and Lucia, together with her sister and her mother, spent 820 days in the basement of this house. They had an entrance to that basement from their apartment. They were helped by their neighbors, two sisters, Olga and Anna Kantarovich. They were also Jews, but they got documents that they were Karaites. If we ever have a talk about Crimea, I'll explain about Karaites and why they were not prosecuted by Nazis. The family survived. Lucia said if she could have ever imagined that when they went down to the dungeon, it would be for 820 days, they would have never had courage to do it. When they were liberated, she did not speak for a long time and finally came out with the book explaining her story. There is another great story of survival. This is the psychiatrist hospital in Odessa. During the war, it was taken care by the father and the son, Shavalov, Evgenia, and Andrei. They managed to hide quite a number of Jews in this hospital as their patients, teaching them how to behave as mentally sick people. After the Second World War, Odessa was rebuilt, and in the Soviet times, it was very popular resort with the beaches, with this atmosphere of the southern city. In post-war, Odessa still preserved its old Jewish character. But I have to tell you that majority of Ukrainian Jews, whether it be Jews from the smaller towns or Kiev or Odessa, left the Ukraine as soon as it was possible in the late 80s and then early 90s, and now they live in the States, in Canada, in Israel, in Australia, and everywhere. The main synagogue was returned to the Jewish community in 1996 and active and welcomes people daily. In Odessa, we say, we Jews are strange people, born in the USSR, willing to return to our homeland, end up in America, but dream to live in Odessa, because our love to Odessa never ends up. There is very nice, lovely Jewish museum in Odessa, which I definitely recommend you to visit whenever this whole story ends up and we'll be able to come visit Ukraine again. There is Holocaust Memorial right in the center of Odessa, and aside of the Holocaust Memorial, there is also the Alley of Righteous. Every tree here was planted to commemorate a Ukrainian or Russian person who saved Jews during the occupation of Odessa during the Second World War. This was my talk for today. Thank you very much for your kind attention and your patience. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. We'll open it up now if anyone has any questions. You can either unmute or raise your hand. It's not like this group to be, oh, Mike, go ahead.
Yes, could you talk a little bit about the battleship Potemkin and the relationship of the Jewish community to that?
Oh, battleship Potemkin. See, it's not as specifically, it was a battleship, so there's no specific Jewish relation to battleship Potemkin, aside of the fact that in general, Jews actively participated in the revolution in Russia. We know that about 25% of the revolutionary leaders, the most active revolutionaries, were Jewish. There was Jewish Socialist Party Bund, which was the best organized and the most efficient part of the social democratic movement in Russia. And so what in every revolutionary activity, you have a giant participation of Jews together with other ethnic and religious groups. Jews had their good reasons to participate in the revolution, looking for social justice. I remind you that, for example, the Pale of Settlement was only canceled after the February Revolution in Russia, so in March 1917. So Jews finally were the most prosecuted group in the country. The group that was addressed by the government with the least justice, and so they were looking for changes.
Anyone else? Any other questions, thoughts, comments? Go ahead, Judy.
I have a question for you. You mentioned something called contract fairs at one point.
Mm-hmm.
And was that something that was ongoing, like an open marketplace every single day, or is it once a week or once a month?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you, Judy. It's once a year event. It's once a year. It's a large event which took place once a year and lasted for several days. And so the difference between contract fair and the regular market is that its main purpose was to let, for example, landlords lease or sell their properties or businesses or factories, or let's say you have a much land where as a landlord where you plant grains, so you can sell all the grains of the future year. So it acted as the stock exchange, basically. So that was a big yearly event.
Thank you.
Very welcome.
Anyone else? We're very quiet today. Well, great. Thank you again, Evgenia. This was amazing. I'd just like to remind everyone that next month on February 13th at 11 a.m., we are doing the Jews of Scandinavia. And if you liked Evgenia, you're going to get a double dose because she will also be taking us on a tour of Scandinavia next month. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for watching my small co-pilot for his brief moment on camera. And thank you again. I hope everyone has a great day and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you again.